What is up, my Squirtleites? It is I, your king, welcoming you to a little bit of a review thing, kind of. I am so bad at doing intros for these impromptu videos, but whatever. I'm just going to dive right in. I don't have a weekly update this week, as you probably could tell, since nothing went up Monday or Tuesday for it. So instead, I'm going to be doing a thoughts video, actually, on Pokemon Sun and Moon. Yes. I actually finished the campaign on Sunday. And I haven't really played it since. I haven't done any endgame stuff yet, but I do want to kind of give my thoughts on the game itself because it was interesting, to say the least. This is going to be completely spoiler-free. Don't worry, I won't give away anything, but I do want to just kind of talk about the game and give it my praises and also a little bit of criticism because that's only fair. This was not a perfect game by any standards, and would I even say it was my favorite Pokemon game? No, but that said, let's jump right in and I can kind of tell you what I thought of the game and stuff like that. So, Pokemon Sun and Moon. I played Sun, personally. I have not touched Moon yet, but, I mean, really the only difference is a couple exclusives and a legendary. I believe they have the exact same campaigns running through, same exact, villains, all that good stuff. There's really not any other deviations aside from the legendary, the theme legendary, and then, a few of the Ultra Beasts, which they introduced into the game, and some other version exclusive Pokemon that are different between the two. Like, I think Alolan Sandshrew is in Moon, and then Alolan Vulpix is in Sun. But that aside, first things first, I want to talk about my biggest grievance because it was the hardest thing going into this game, and that was the opening of the game. So, it's been 2 years since the last Pokemon game, which for Pokemon standards has kind of been a while. It's been a yearly series for quite some time now prior to this. I believe all the way since, I think almost since Diamond and Pearl. I think it was Platinum, and then the following year was Heart Gold, Soul Silver, then Black and White, then Black, White 2. Yeah, I think it was literally from Platinum to Oris, Omega Ruby, Alpha Sapphire. It was a yearly thing. I can't remember exactly, but I think that was a whole... it was a yearly series during that time, and could be longer. I can't remember exactly, but they took a year off last year with, and while they waited for Sun and Moon to come out, and they released it on the same hardware as the last two entries, being Omega Ruby, Alpha Sapphire, and X and Y, and they did some significant improvements this time. They did some graphical improvements, but with the 2-year break, it almost felt like Game Freak thought it was necessary to kind of reintroduce everyone to the mechanics of Pokemon with the opening of this game, and I didn't really quite understand why they did that. In essence, the entire, I would say, first 2 hours of the game was exposition heavy and very tutorial-esque. This is not a spoiler, this is just kind of what you're in for going into the beginning of the game, and I want to make that clear because it's worth knowing, especially for those who are going to be put off by it very quickly. I do want to say that, yes, the first 2 hours kind of suck. They really do. You do get acquainted with these pretty good characters in the game, but through most of the first segment, because the game is split up into it's kind of split up into different segments. Of the first segment, which really is the first island of the game. It's almost entirely just a big tutorial, like the whole thing. And it's kind of, it's a little bit too long-winded. Okay, very long-winded. And in fact, it did kind of exhaust even the most diehard Pokemon fans I know and made them take a break for a little bit, for a couple days before they jump back into it. Like, it was that bad. Even the most diehard Pokemon fans. And I love Pokemon, don't get me wrong, but I'm not obsessed with it at quite the level as a lot of other people I know. So I pushed through it, though. I pushed through it, and I was pleasantly surprised after I pushed through it. But I want to just bring attention that those first 2 hours, I would say probably an hour and a half to 3, anywhere in between that, depending on how much stop and go you're going to do, or how much grinding for certain Pokemon you want to get very early on. It's going to be very tutorial heavy, and it's going to be very exhausting as a result. But that aside, some of the things I really liked about this game were its characters and its storytelling, actually. I personally think that Pokemon has is very overrated in the storytelling department. I honestly think it's always been very weak. It's not really anything. I mean, it's there, but it's no more there than like the campaign of a Call of Duty game. It's no more there than the campaign of, well, really just any kind of AAA title. Of a Mario game or something along those lines. Like, it's probably a little bit more involved than a Mario game, I guess, but not much. It's not anything huge. It's not anything impactful or powerful. I know Platinum sort of played around with that a little bit, but aside from that game, there really weren't any huge moments in those games story-wise. The storytelling was okay. The writing was, it's juvenile. I mean, that's not saying it's bad. It's just it's very much geared towards a younger audience, and it's really not gonna. I don't really see how it has an effect over anyone older than the age of like 12 or something like that, because it really isn't. It's not anything spectacular. The games are so much far evolved beyond what they do now. In fact, I would say the only one that really had an impact was Red and Blue, and I only say that because at the time, that really was the extent of storytelling in games at the time. But the problem is the series, in terms of storytelling, has never evolved past Red and Blue, leading almost all the way up till Black and White. Black and White, it made a little bit better strides, but aside from that game, really hasn't done anything substantial. This game took a big leap from what the standard was set by X and Y and Black and White. A big leap. Much, much better storytelling. Very well-written characters. They did seem very tropey at first, very similar to the way that characters are written in the older games, but they evolve past that as the game goes, and I was incredibly impressed with how the storytelling was. I still wouldn't say it's anything magnificent, but it is one of the better stories from an RPG I've played, if not the best. It's up there. It's a really, really well done story, very well told, with a lot of very memorable and engaging characters. Sure, some were kind of annoying. Sure, a lot of them were tropey. Sure, a lot of them were stereotypical, but they were incredibly memorable, very well fleshed out, and I don't want to spoil any of them, but there was one character in particular who's very, very close to the protagonist throughout most of this game, who I honestly thought was the best character in the entire series yet. Extremely well done, and they actually took time in the game to have moments. They weren't too drawn out. They didn't take you out of the action for too long, but it had moments in the story, which is so much more than I can say for the other games. I mean, the only other moments I can think of are the Distortion World in Platinum, or the Rayquaza coming out of the sky in Emerald, or Ruby and Sapphire, or whatever. I mean, well, actually, that was just Emerald. That's like the only moments I can really think of. The other games didn't really have that, aside from one thing. This had several, and it was very well done and very memorable for it. I am going to actually remember the story. The gameplay is the same. They added a couple new mechanics, some of which were okay, some of which I didn't really care for. One mechanic, and I'll just, this is, again, not a spoiler, this is a pretty well-known mechanic, but it's, you should know about it going into the game. There's a whole mechanic where Pokemon will call for help if they get weak, or actually, honestly, sometimes they'll call even if they haven't taken any damage at all. If you can't kill the Pokemon, it will call for help, and sometimes, about 50% of the time, another of its kind, or depending on certain battles, something completely different that will complement it, will appear. And it's all dependent on the Pokemon and whatnot, but oh boy, that mechanic was really cool in some ways, because it did make fights more interesting. It definitely, in certain fights, made them incredibly challenging, and actually some of the best fights the series have ever had. At the same time, when in conjunction with certain wild Pokemon battles, it would make these fights drag out unnecessarily long for just, you could probably go through 5, 6, 7 Pokemon, and it just, the fight would never end. Just never end. I'm actually very much reminded of the Patrol, or Koopatrols from the end of Paper Mario in the final dungeon, and these were like the last enemies in the game, who would, instead of attacking you sometimes, they would call for help. Now, Pokemon, they can attack you and then call for help. That's not implicit. It's not part of their turn. They can do both in the same turn. After the turn's over, they can call for help. And this can just make the fights drag out forever if you're unable to one-shot the Pokemon, which in its own right, I think was a little bit absurd. There were ways to increase this rate, which can be good, because sometimes you could have them call for rare Pokemon, that's why you'd want to do it. But aside from that, there were a lot of problems inherent with this system. And again, it would just make some fights drag out for unnecessarily long periods of time, and would sometimes make wild Pokemon battles actually way more unreasonably difficult than they needed to be. And really, you might as well have just ran at that point. I mean, if you couldn't one-shot it and you keep getting penalized for that, I don't know. I wasn't really the biggest fan of that mechanic entirely. I think they should have like lowered the rate at which that would have succeeded for wild Pokemon. But that's just me. And lowered it drastically, I mean. A lot of the new Pokemon designs are really good. I actually became a bigger fan of a lot of them once I saw them all in game, because I'll admit, as many of the new Pokemon as I loved, I think the new region had personally the most Pokemon I'd hated. But it seems like they refined a lot of the designs and the looks, and even in some ways, in some of them, some of the character models of some of the characters or some of the Pokemon we'd seen thus far, and I gained an appreciation for a lot more of the Pokemon as a result. Another thing I loved about the game was it was challenging. It was actually very challenging. In fact, if you want to make the game hard, take off the experience share. Not normal. It makes the game very hard. This game is explicitly designed with the experience share in mind. It's not like X and Y, where you could skip half the trainers and still say plenty leveled with the experience share. No. Same with ORAS. This game, if you keep the experience share on all the time and fight every single trainer, you'll just barely stay up to level. The game becomes a real challenge if you take the experience share off. So if you really want to make it hard for yourself, also probably include a lot more grinding, which personally I can't stand grinding, so that's why I didn't want to do that. But if you're willing to grind a ton, if you really want to make it strategic and really have to plan things out and make it a very tough experience, take off that experience share. It's by far the hardest Pokemon's been yet without it. With it, it had its challenging moments. There were a couple fights that I actually lost, but it wasn't too ridiculous, but you could still see that it was designed with the experience share in mind. It was definitely a step up over X and Y and ORAS in that regard. A lot more challenging than those games. The presentation's better. Unfortunately, there were some issues with playing it on older 3DS hardware. I have an older version of the 3DS XL, not the new 3DS XL. So anytime I was in a double battle, I would experience slowdown, especially during attack animations. There were also certain Z moves, which are the new super powerful moves that have been introduced in the game. Their animations would sometimes cause some slowdown. A couple cutscenes, but they caused very minimal slowdown, not like excessive like the battles did. But aside from that, it wasn't too bad. I really didn't have as much a problem with it. I don't honestly really mind frame drops. I mean, yeah, it looks ugly, but I don't mind it too much because it's not affecting real-time gameplay like it would be in another game, so it's not near as an egregious of a problem. But just be aware that if you're playing on older 3DS hardware, you are going to experience quite a bit of it, especially in double battles and when using Z moves and whatnot. And that was another thing I liked, were the Z moves that were implemented. They're basically super powerful moves that were added in that you can use once per battle, and they augment current moves if you're holding the corresponding crystal. You can use that instead of like a Megastone or something, which, as far as I know, I think Megastones are an endgame thing anyway. But that aside, they don't really augment it quite as much as you think. For the most part, they bring it to about the same power levels as something like a Hyper Beam, possibly a little stronger. However, you can also get your same type of attack bonus advantage. While this seems a little bit ludicrous, it's not actually. There were several occasions where I used a Z move and it would not take out the Pokemon I wanted to use on. It's kind of like I need this thing dead, or at least very close to dead, as quickly as possible. So I will use this, but this is my shot. This is it. This is all I got in certain situations, which is, again, very helpful for the higher difficulty. But there were plenty of situations, not even if like the move was not very effective, even if it was like normally effective, sometimes even if it was super effective, my Z moves would not take out the Pokemon I was hitting. They're not as powerful as they look. I think the most powerful Z move I used had a base power of 180, which is 30 above Hyper Beam, which is still really strong in its own right, don't get me wrong, and there's no recharge after it like with something like Hyper Beam or Giga Impact, but still, it's not like explosion. It's not completely game breaking, it's not that bad. So and again, it replaces something like a Mega Stone or something like that if you had it, which would make your entire Pokemon's move pool more powerful. Your Pokemon in general more powerful for the duration of the fight. So, and yeah, I mean, that's really, when you think about it, I think Mega Evolutions are, in retrospect, a lot more powerful than Z moves are. But that aside, I honestly liked the implementation of those. I was genuinely impressed that they were not ridiculously overpowered, and I kind of liked that. And again, the characters were great. The visual design is great. The region looks beautiful. It was very, very well designed. Probably up there as my favorite region yet. I don't know if it quite passes Hoenn or Kanto for me yet, but it's pretty darn close. Very, very pretty region. Very tropical feel to it all, but there were definitely variances from that as well. A lot of mountainous areas, some grasslands and whatnot. It was, and forest too. It was a good looking region. They did a really good job with what they had, especially with the 3DS kind of at this point just being a flat out ugly system. I would be willing to say Sun and Moon is arguably one of the best looking games, if not the best looking game on the system. So yeah, all in all, Sun and Moon was very, very good. The pacing at the beginning was my biggest issue with the game, and honestly is probably the only reason this is not my favorite Pokemon game to date. It really kills the replay value of this game, which I feel is a problem, because you just don't want to go through that opening again. But that aside, the 2 hours were bad, but the 20 plus, 30 plus that followed it, depending on what difficulty you want to play at, more than make up for it, and definitely make it a great experience in its own right. I mean, it was great. I really loved it. Oh, and that's another thing. The soundtrack. That's another thing I've never really understood was I mean, I get the catchiness, but I've never understood why people laud the Pokemon games as some of the best soundtracks in existence. No, I personally think that's completely... I don't really understand that at all. I feel like that's completely nostalgic based. Now, I can totally see why people love the songs, because yes, they're very catchy, they're very nostalgic, they're very memorable. But when it comes to, like, you know, the best and most grand and most well done music, I don't think it comes even close to many console games, or even there are handheld games I'd say that would beat it. Heck, I think Okamiden on the DS of all things, which that crappy sound card, is one of the best soundtracks of all time. And this game and Pokemon games have not come close. Until this one. Sun and Moon was a fantastic soundtrack. Like, really, really good. I was actually blown away by a lot of the music in it. It was amazing. So bombastic, so well done. Specifically during the cutscenes, I think is when it was at its best, but there were a lot of battle themes and a lot of area themes that were very well done too. This was just a big step up for the series, and I really, really enjoyed it. I don't know why they felt they needed to pander or cater so much at the beginning and hold your hand, especially when the later game literally went the opposite route and became suddenly super difficult, and also was actually very adult in the way it handled things. I would say this is by far the most adult Pokemon game yet. It just seemed very odd that the game was so slow and so micromanaging in the beginning. But aside from that, and aside from a couple design decisions and a couple technical issues, Pokemon Sun is a fantastic game, and it is so worth picking up and so worth playing, and I highly, highly recommend it. And I don't do scores or anything, and this is not like a proper review, so I would not do that anyway. But yeah, that's all I can say. High recommendation for Pokemon Sun and Moon, if you really, really want it. Personally, I would have to say real quick that if you play through the game and you do not pick up a Salazzle, you are an idiot, because that was the best Pokemon I had on my team for the entire playthrough. Poison Fire, just let that sink in, okay? It's a really good Pokemon. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so very, very much for watching, or listening, I guess. There wasn't really anything to watch. But yeah, thank you all so very much, and I will see you all in the next one.